Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today we're celebrating Earth Day. So I'm going to go quickly through the agenda. Our guest speaker today is Kim Delfino. We will be speaking with her about how to be a part of the solution. We will then talk about the McGeorge MSL in water and environmental law, talk about what makes our program distinctive, and next steps, and then of course we'll open it for Q&A. So with no further ado, the biggest part of this presentation is our conversation today with Professor Delfino, who is an adjunct professor of law at McGeorge and also the president and founder of Earth Advocacy. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to join.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background, Kim, and what made you decide to create this, consulting firm?
Sure. So my background is that I am a graduate of McGeorge School of Law many years ago, graduated in 1993, and I headed off to Washington, D.C. to actually start my practice as an attorney with a small public interest law firm called Meyer and Glitzenstein. And I practiced law for about almost 4 years, representing environmental organizations, mainly focusing on the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act. And it was very interesting. I enjoyed it to a certain extent, but I actually decided that I enjoyed policy more than I enjoyed litigation. So I switched after 4 years and took a position with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group as their conservation advocate. And I started doing policy. And I was in DC for about 7 years. And then I came back to California and I opened up the California office for Defenders of Wildlife. And I was their program director for almost 20 years. And I worked primarily in California, a lot of work in Sacramento with the administration, state administration, state legislature, worked on a lot of different types of issues. And I did that for 20 years. And then I decided that I wanted to try to do something a little bit different, but staying in the same space, but I wanted to be able to work with more than just defenders. I thought I had a lot of experience in policy, in organizing, in the legal issues around land use, water, wildlife, and it would be kind of interesting to branch out and work with like Audubon and the Pew Charitable Trusts and California Council of Land Trusts and Sonoma Land Trust and still working with Defenders of Wildlife, California Native Plant Society. So I created my own advocacy firm, Earth Advocacy. It's just me, myself, and I work as a consultant with many environmental organizations and also with foundations. And I represent organizations in the state legislature. I work on administrative issues before the state agencies. And I also help sort of think through strategy and policy over the long term, particularly with foundations, as we're sort of thinking through like, what's the next big thing? How do we want to move things forward? So so I figured that would be a nice way to sort of end my career, maybe doing this for about 10 years or so.
Nice, thank you. Very interesting. And I know so many people share the same passion as you, being an advocate on behalf of the environment at large, if I may say, presented that way. And so you have a particular role currently, like you've explained to us like your career, but what other type of career can people have in this field, especially like that do not require a law degree?
Right.
That do not, sorry, let me just be a little bit more precise, that do not require a JD degree.
Right. So there's a lot of different things that people can do. So like, I'm not practicing law in the traditional sense anymore. I don't litigate, I don't go to court, that kind of thing. But, and frankly, the kind of work that I do now, I don't necessarily have to have a JD. To do lobbying work, to do policy advocacy work, You don't have to have a JD. It's not required. It's nice sometimes because then you understand sort of, how to write statutes, how does it all fit together, but you don't need to have that. And you can work in a lot of different ways. So, I work with people in the state legislature that work entirely on environmental issues, committee staff. So in the state assembly, you have like the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife Committee and the Assembly Natural Resources Committee. They do all kinds of policy issues, and you don't have to have a JD to do that. You can work in offices as ledge staff and work on issues involving environmental issues. You can go to work in state government and work on a variety of different issues. Department of Fish and Wildlife has their biodiversity conservation program where you could do work there, or in the Natural Resources Agency, they have positions for people that want to work there. Wildlife Conservation Board. I mean, there's actually we're very lucky in California because there is such a focus on environmental protection that we have very robust agencies that people can work within. You can even work at the city level on environmental initiatives, smart growth, transportation. Sometimes people don't realize that they don't necessarily make the connection that, say, transportation is not an environmental issue, but it very much is an environmental issue. How you get yourself to and from work and school, whether are you polluting the environment, or are you trying to reduce vehicles mile travel? Are you trying to have more public transportation? Are we switching over to cleaner energy? And that brings up the energy sector. I mean, you can go to work for a renewable energy company and do permitting and compliance. You could work for foundations. A lot of foundations, they're people with policy backgrounds, and they're shaping initiatives sort of behind the scenes and then funding organizations to be able to move those initiatives forward. So there's, and then you can work for nonprofits. So, my life has been spent, the majority of it, working in the nonprofit world. And there's many organizations you can work for in the policy realm. And again, in California, we're very lucky because we have a population that does value, for the most part, environmental protection. And so a lot of the conservation organizations, environmental nonprofits, they have staff here in California because we can use California as like a testing area to move bigger policies to the national level. California started off with climate change and AB 32 and the goal to reduce carbon emissions. That started here, and it sort of spread to other states and to the federal government. The effort to protect 30% of lands and waters, that was something international, but California was the first state to pick up and say, we're going to take this and use it as a goal for our state. And they actually today just released the final report on how they're going to go about protecting 30% of our lands and waters. We're well ahead of the federal government on that issue. So there's so much opportunity here in California to be able to do that and to use like a master's degree in order to be able to work in all those different areas. I think is important, and you've got great opportunities to do that.
Thank you. So if I can pick a little bit on what you mentioned, like you started by saying a JD is not required, but it's certainly helpful at times.
Yeah.
And you just ended by saying like having a master's degree can help you in this career. So if we can just like a little bit more precisely talking about the MSL program.
Right.
So how is having a legal background helpful, like perhaps a little bit more practically or concretely?
So I find, particularly when so a couple different ways. So first is in the state legislature, it's really helpful to understand how laws are made, what words have meaning. There's a whole body of administrative law. There's a difference between using may in a statute versus shall in a statute. Understanding all of those differences, the nuances, what does it mean when in the legal context or technical kind of issues, those are really important to have that kind of legal background, because I've been in many situations where people will suggest language in a bill and they don't have a legal background, so they don't understand that what they're actually suggesting isn't really workable from a legal perspective. And so, you have to sort of step in and say, no, actually, this language is not going to be very helpful. It's going to be litigated to death. We need to be more precise about how we're, drafting something. So in that sense, it's very helpful to have that. And then to have a policy background, it just shows that you've spent some time understanding, the various aspects of environmental issues. Environmental issues are very complex. We have, water, air, land. There's many statutes governing and laws governing like how you do things. And so it's important to understand sort of how they all work together. I think that getting an MSL, it shows that, you have a deeper understanding of how all these parts work together, how to fashion successful policy. And then I guess I talked about the legislature, but it's also helpful on the administrative side. So if the state administration or federal, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comes out with a rule, having a background in law and policy will help you understand, like, what are they asking? How does this work? If you want to influence how rulemakings or policies are put together, having that background is really instrumental in you being effective and good at what you're doing. So yeah, those are, it's actually quite important, I think.
Because so is that correct that in the environmental field, like a lot of the law is actually through regulations?
Yeah, well, yeah. First you have to have the law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you enact, say, like the Endangered Species Act.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole body of regulations that comes after that, because usually what happens is, well, almost always what happens is, the legislature will write, whether it's Congress or the legislature, they'll write a law. And they're just not going to be able to write something so complete that they're going to get at every little aspect. So they sort of leave the implementation of something to the agencies. And in order to be able to effectively implement a law, you usually have to write regulations more clearly defining what various things mean. So for example, in the Endangered Species Act, there's a section in the Endangered Species Act called Section 7, and it talks about how you shall not jeopardize the continued existence of a species. Okay, well, what does that mean? Congress didn't give you more detail about that, but then there's regulations that follow that more clearly define what is continued existence, what does jeopardy mean, what does species mean? And so this is sort of like how agencies will more clearly define things. They can also, after passing regulations, so you have the law, the agency promulgates regulations. A lot of times they'll promulgate guidance documents or policy directives or internal memorandums. So there's all different kinds of aspects of sort of further breaking down and explaining, what does it mean to actually have to comply with the law that ultimately, is passed by Congress or the legislature. So it can be pretty complex. And then a lot of times you've got court cases that are further defining, someone will challenge something as, well, they're violating the regulation because we're interpreting it X way. Well, the court might come back and be like, well, your interpretation is wrong. Here's the way it should be interpreted, or your interpretation is right. So it's further sort of refining like what we mean by the words that we're choosing. So yeah, it can be very complicated.
Yeah, so just with your explanation, like it's, at least for me, it highlighted the fact that having an understanding of how the legal framework and how all of this needs to fit together in order to have a proper implementation, how important it is to have that knowledge.
Yes, understanding administrative law, understanding, the basics of how to do administrative law, how to understand how laws are written and how are they implemented. That's all super important. Yeah.
And this is like, this is two of our required courses in both the MSL in government law and policy and the water and environmental law. Like we have two courses that focus on that. But if I could spend a little bit, my last question for you is really much like to talk about your course. So how do you incorporate all those skills that you just described in your course? And so on the flip side, when the students enroll in your course, like what can they expect?
So the course goes through federal law. So it just focuses on federal law. And it talks about, it does an overview of the most important environmental laws that are out there. So it starts off looking at what we call CERCLA, which is basically the Superfund law that looks at when you have contamination or dumping. And you've basically created these toxic sites and like who's responsible for cleanup, what does that mean? And it walks through sort of all the various components of that. And then we talk about the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a very important law because that is something that's applied to all federal actions. You have to look at your environmental impacts associated with those federal actions. We talk about the Administrative Procedure Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. When we're talking about the Clean Air Act, we talk about the linkage to climate change and how that's evolved. And then we finish up talking about environmental citizen suits, like how do we enforce laws? And so what we try to do is give a good overview of all the most important environmental laws. How do they work, the nuts and bolts of how they work, the court cases that are interpreting various components of those laws. And then the students are asked to think about, so it's not just, being able to recite a section of the Clean Water Act, but it's like, how is that being applied? How do you define a navigable water? If I gave you an example, would you say that's a navigable water? Is that a point source? Is that not a point source? Please explain why you think so. We also get into policy areas. We talk about, when you're promulgating regulations, how science changes so quickly. And how do you incorporate that when you have something as clunky as adopting regulations, which sometimes can take years? We go into like how regulations are being challenged back and forth via different federal administrations. So we have one set of regulations that are adopted with one administration, and then the next administration comes in and pulls those back and then adopts another, and sort of how that goes back and forth. So I think it's trying to give everyone a really good overview of the basics, but then trying to also help understand how it's being applied in like the real world setting, and giving students the opportunity to sort of think through some of the tough issues that practitioners have to deal with on a regular basis if you're going to be working in the environmental policy and law field. So yeah, that's the hope, at least.
Thank you. And what's the final projects in your course? Like at the end, is it like I'm assuming it's not a regular law school exam as
so they do have a final exam, but we do have a group project. So about 2/3 of the way into the class, there is one group project. And it's really interesting because it's basically asking the students to sort of just if they were king for a day or whatever, how should we as a nation try to achieve our greenhouse gas goal reduction efforts through choosing how we do our energy and transportation choices. So they work for 2 weeks in a group setting where maybe 3 or 4 students will get together and they'll look at this and they'll sort of choose 8 strategies, and they have to explain why they chose those 8 strategies. And then they also have to talk about, how would the different sectors think about, so you've made those 8 strategy choices, like you've chosen carbon capture, you've chosen wind energy, renewable energy, nuclear energy, whatever the combination might be. How would the different sectors react to your choice, your mix of choices? If you were so how would the environmental community, what would they think about the choices you made? What would developing countries think about the choices you've made? What would industrial or manufacturers think about it? So it's kind of like, again, sort of pulling yourself into the real world and thinking about like how do we fit this all together? How does who wins, who loses, who's going to have an opinion about this, who And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting group project, and I like it because, again, it's like more of a real world application of, we have these greenhouse gas goals. We need to reduce carbon emissions, but how do we do it? And so that's the main project that they have. Otherwise, it's they do journal entries. We do the other thing I really enjoy, and I think the students enjoyed, is discussions. So I'll pose a question, and then the students will have an opportunity to post their response, and then they each have to respond to at least two. So you have these discussion threads where they're going back and forth talking to each other about, like, oh, that was a really good point that you made. I think X, Y, and Z. And it's nice because it's very organic, and they get to, especially on in a course that's online, this gives the students an opportunity to really interact with each other and share ideas, and think broadly. So that's kind of how, and then there are quizzes. So, and then we have a final exam. So that's how the course goes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So if you wouldn't mind staying with us for a few more minutes while I just quickly go over the curriculum for the MSL in Water and Environmental Law, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay.
So our program, as we just talked about, is not your traditional law program. Is not a JD program. You're not. We're not teaching you to pass the bar exam, but it's rather for those of you who seek practical knowledge of law and policy in a particular field. So in this field is water and environmental law. Our program is fully online, and it's asynchronous, but yet it is still interactive. Our curriculum is, so our program is 26 credits. Pretty much half of those credits are required courses, the other half are electives. We talk about the legislature and lawmaking and the executive branch and the administrative state course when Professor Delfino was presenting, those are two of our foundational courses. We also have an introduction to legal analysis and analytical skills that is based on contracts that we require all of our students to take. And finally, then you get to take some of the courses that are just more particular to this field, so water resources law and environmental law. I'm not going to go through the list of all the courses, but as you notice, we do have some courses that are more government law and policy oriented, because there is a lot of overlap between those two fields. So our students who are enrolled in the government law and policy may end up taking some of the water and environmental law courses, and vice versa. So we've talked about this a few times. Our programs is asynchronous. It gives you the flexibility to do the work at a time that is convenient for you. Yet, I just want to emphasize on that it is a rigorous program, and we still have weekly deadlines. So we have the interactive weekly discussions that Professor Delfino mentioned. We have ungraded graded quizzes. There is regular feedback from the professor, as well as really an engagement, in a class through this discussion, through the chat, structured and unstructured, and that creates really a nice collegial online learning community. Our students have all give us very good feedback on this. So I just want to emphasize, I am really objectively saying we really do have an interactive program. Our students end up actually creating study groups. We cap our classes to 20 students, and we're doing so because we want to make sure that students get to engage with each other, and that the professor gets an opportunity and an availability to engage individually with each of our students. So the next step for those of you who are interested is to start your application. Our application deadline is June 6th. For those of you who are attending or viewing this webinar, please email us, and we'll be happy to send you an application fee waiver. Because we're not preparing you to take a bar exam, the GRE or the LSAT is not required. Rather, we do a holistic review of your application. We will ask you for a writing sample because, as you can imagine, in an online asynchronous course, like having strong foundational writing skills is essential. So that's the only thing that is unique about our application. So with no further ado, let's open it up for questions. And in the meantime, because we're now ending this formal presentation, I am gonna just end our recording.